Psychoanalysis, School Integration Series, discussion third, the oral stage. We started off this series with a discussion on the innate, what is inborn in us, the constitutional, the innate. Second discussion, we went into primary narcissism, and we said the innate and primary narcissism we can look at as precursors to real operational integration of schools, and we start that today with the oral stage. So the oral stage was defined by Freud. So we are focusing on 0 to 5 years, and Freud divided this period, the most important period in the development of an individual, into three parts: 0 to 2 oral stage, 2 to 3.5 anal stage, and 3.5 to 5 the Oedipal stage or the phallic stage. Some Freudian thinkers stretch it from 3.5 to 7, but usually it is kept at 3.5 to 5. Today we are focusing on 0 to 2, what various schools have to say about what happens in this stage, and to what degree can we integrate these schools specific to this period of 0 to 2, the oral stage. For Freud, oral stage being successfully completed, developmentally speaking, was associated with development of trust. It was also a stage where oral rage is seen, and that can increase or reduce or get healed. This is also a stage where narcissism, and by that we mean secondary narcissism, as Freud defined it, that comes to play, if at all, if it is there. So for Freud, the oral stage was essentially important from standpoint of trust, dealing with oral rage, and development or non-development of secondary narcissism. But if we look at it from a Kleinian point of view, the same period is important from three different perspectives. Klein talks about the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position, the PSD, the paranoid schizoid position, and the depressive position, happening in the first 6 to 8 months. Paranoid schizoid usually in the first 3 to 4 months, and then slowly the depressive position by the time it is 6 to 8 months should be there. Klein also talks about very important element of psychotic fantasies which happen in this period of 0 to 2 more intensely in the period 0 to 1. And this period of 0 to 1 essentially is very rich and terrifyingly rich at times in terms of fantasies. Another important element from Kleinian point of view in this period as it happens is what is called internalization of a good, reliable, stable object. So this is very important from a Kleinian standpoint, not only for mental health, but also as the core for both mental and physical health. The internalization of a good, reliable, stable object. So this IGO is very important. So from Freudian standpoint, these are the important elements in 0 to 2. From a Kleinian standpoint, these are the important phenomena 0 to 2, the same period. From another school in the same period, for Winnicott, good enough mothering gem is very important in the first 2 years. And that helps one develop a soothing, stabilizing core, which is an antidote, a preventive, a curative for anything that disintegrates, that creates chaos, that lets loose out of control of the coordinator of the psyche. For Kohut, the formation of a healthy self from 0 to almost 3.5 to 4, you can even stretch it to 5. But very important part in the formation of the healthy self also occurs between 0 to 2, precisely 0 to 3. For him, the creation of the healthy self strengthens the coordinator of the psyche. And in his opinion, if the coordinator of the psyche is strengthened by the healthy self, he does not use the word coordinator, but this is implied. All that he would say is, if a healthy self is formed, cohesiveness of the healthy self would be high, and therefore disintegration would be difficult and health would prevail. And the unhealthy self would go into a continuum of either being a psychotic self or a borderline self or a narcissistic self. And as you move from narcissistic to borderline to psychotic, the tendency to easily disintegrate would go up and cohesiveness would go down. For Margaret Mahler, 0 to 2 is a period of passing through natural autism. It's a period of beginning of the fusion individuation process, dealing with the urge to merge I and not I formation, and the types of I, which Margaret Mahler does not talk about, but we can bring it from other schools. So let us say we keep this separate. So for Mahler, Mahler believes that we all pass through a natural phase of autism-like state, and that is universal to all human beings very early in our life. This stage of natural autism is very close to Freud's concept of primary narcissism. Both of them allude to some state which is not exactly speaking an object relation stage. The difference being, Freud's primary narcissism is very certain that there is no object relations in that state. In Mahler, there is no certitude that there is no relation, but what is certain is there is no preference for a relation, and that is a difference. Being absolutely certain that there is no object relation and saying that there is no preference for object relation are two different things. In the strongest form of Mahler's universal natural autism. In its strongest form, it would overlap with Freud's primary narcissism. Otherwise, it would be a state. If you put a continuum of primary narcissism and object relations, the natural autism state would overlap slightly with primary narcissism and then stretch over to overlap slightly with object relations. For Mahler, the fusion individuation was very important, and she talks about two natural forces at work. The force of fusion, to go back to where we came from, to merge with it, and to annihilate this separateness, this isolation, this limitedness, and to regain that oceanic whole that we are in search of. At the same time, there is a force of individuation to separate from that oceanic whole and be oneself. And this tension is universal and ongoing across life. The tension to fuse and merge into an oceanic self and lose oneself, and the desire to separate from that oceanic self and be oneself. So this is a natural tension immanent in our hardware. And Mahler talks about in 0 to 2, not only does natural autism play out, not only does fusion individuation start in some way, not only do we handle this urge to merge, but it also gets into the formation of I and not I. The crystallization of I, and from then by negation, a definition of not I. And this brings us to the more complicated discussion of what is this I and what is this not I. In short, without going into much elaboration, not I can be looked at in various ways. One good way can be Lacanian way of the small other and the big other. So apart from the small other, the big other, and the world, the small other, the big other would constitute in one way, that can be one classification of not I. Another Lacanian idea would be that I is what is created out of the mechanisms, and not I is the primal condition of disintegration, which is actually a reversal of the fact that the primal disintegration in fact is the real I, and not I is an imagined cohesive I according to Lacan. But okay, so that is, let us keep it there. Now let us go into the other ways I can be defined. One way to define I, various types of I, is to define a biological I, a social I, a self-perceived I, an authentic I, and a spiritual I. And there are, as we go deeper in exploration, we come across these different parts of ourselves. So what Mahler is talking about is a very clear primary idea, a very rudimentary idea of what is I and what is not I in the biological sense. She's not going into types of I or types of not I or the constituents of I and the constituents of not I. This is talking about a very biological, very rudimentary way in which the first clarity that we develop of what is I and what is not I. So it is almost like development of the biological I and development of the biological not I. So this also happens in 0 to 2. For Jung, it's a question of archetypal activation. Jung would have no problem with the concept of primary narcissism, where even the child archetype is yet to be activated and only the self is fully active. And therefore the feeling of the oceanic whole, or there is a feeling of the unus mundus somehow, and this would take us to Jung's second definition of the self, where the self was seen not as the center of the psyche, but spread all around and also working through the center of the psyche, which was a more mystical idea, difficult to fit into one model of the mind, because it would take us into almost a theory of everything kind of situation. So for Jung, primary narcissism would not be a problem. And the earliest archetypal activation would be that of the infant and the parents. The archetype of the infant would govern the emotions and behavior of the child, and the archetype of the parent or the mother would be projected into the mother and activate the mother's maternal archetype. It's a paired activation of archetype, one in oneself and a corresponding paired archetype in the other. So for Jung, it would be activation of very early child mother archetypes, the yin yang archetypes, the explorer archetype after the first year in the child. In fact, Jung has not given a timeline of archetypal activation. So he roughly talks about periods of life in his program of life, but does not talk about exact timelines. In Eastern schools, in 0 to 2, there is discussion about how past lives, past karma, and the purpose of the self in this life, they influence the constitution and the innate response mechanism of the child. So there is a partial continuation of past life and a partial activation of the constitution according to karma, and the need for the self to experience something special in this life. So they look at 0 to 2, apart from other things, as involving these elements additionally. So this is what various schools and approaches have to say about the same period of 0 to 2 as to what happens. And in all probability, all of it is happening. We just don't know how to integrate it in terms of a very cohesive, clear, and sequential theory. Like if we talk of clients-object relations, the object relations are also present when Freud is talking about relationship to the mother, or Winnicott is talking about good enough mothering, or Kohut is talking about formation of a healthy self. So the phenomena which are happening are so rich and complicated that you can look at it from different standpoints and analyze it, and it appears as though you're talking about something completely separate from what others are talking, but actually everything is happening at once. We are just not able to synthesize it. Let us go slightly deeper into Freud, Klein, and Mahler and slowly get into the integration thing. One of the points we come across in Freud is the idea of the child being almost like a little man, a miniaturized version of a man. So the thinking process is not described as developing from rudimentary thinking to full thinking, which Klein slightly does. That Klein does talk about movement from fantasy to reality. So if we try then to put them together, let us say there is an element of Freudian trust in 0 to 2. Then there would be internalization of that trust through internalization of a good, reliable, stable object. There would be a search for the lost oceanic oneness of the fusion, of the type of fusion that Mahler talks about. And there would be object relations moving from part to full. And if we combine that object relations part to full with Freud's idea of primary narcissism and Lacan's idea of primary chaos, we find there is a continuum which we have not actually paid attention to. It's very important. The continuum of primary narcissism and primary hell. Let us spend 5 minutes upon it. If we look at the state of extremely early part, we can visualize that state, conceptualize that state in two ways. One is it does not involve objects. Second is it involves part objects. If we go by the first one, a state which does not involve objects, then Freud talks about the state of primary narcissism. It is a state of grandiosity, omnipotence, bliss, ecstasy, and self-sufficiency. But there is a counterpart to that state, and that is the state of primary hell. Because when affects have not yet found their object and the affects are active, it is not only the positive effect of bliss, grandiosity, a comprehensive satisfaction and self-sufficiency which would be awakened. Alternately, there would be states of heaven and hell. So what Freud talks about is that heaven-like state of primary narcissism, the state of oceanic oneness and bliss. The other end of the continuum is the state of primary hell, which is, if you look at Lacan's primary chaos, the worst state into which this primary chaos can get into would be the state of primary hell. And both these states are experienced by the infant, or let me say, should be experienced by the infant if there is a pre-object state. It cannot be that a state of primary narcissism exists, but the state of primary hell does not exist. You cannot have a heaven without hell, a perpetual heaven till the objects come in and bring hell along with them. So the other is the hell is not a correct idea in this context. So we have a situation where affects are yet to find objects, cognition is yet to find objects, the psychic activity is yet to find objects, and therefore there are, when difficult affects are activated in oneself, there is nowhere to go but oneself. Or even if one does not talk about affects going to a destination, even if we just talk about affects being activated, even in that case, you will have activation of pleasant affects and activation of unpleasant affects. And because there is no attenuation, no moderation, no object to deflect the affects towards, and as we believe, no attenuation by the regulating mechanism. Alternately, ecstasy and terror would be felt just as you feel it in the paranoid schizoid position, but even with more intensity before the paranoid schizoid position starts. So there would be a super PS before the PS actually begins. And then the part object paranoid schizoid position would begin. And in the part object paranoid schizoid position would be this kingdom of fantasy and fantasy, the conscious fantasy and the unconscious fantasy. And this would happen only after a primary affect has actually found part objects. This would also mean that the epistemological process of thinking also does not just start off with birth, with objects of the external world, but rather it starts off with sensations of the body. That based upon the whether the biological working of the body, sensations are present in the body. And these sensations become the sort of evaluation precipitators for the epistemological process. So what we have is a completely biologically driven affect activation followed by epistemological evaluation of sensations getting activated, followed by the epistemological process moving into part objects. And then the epistemological elementals moving into creation of unconscious and conscious fantasy. Quite an amount of fantasy would be actually free of outer experience. Would the inner world object creation in fantasy be informed by something transpersonal? And if so, would it happen before the part object state or after the part object state? Is something which is an open question. So all of this is in the 0 to 2. What is also in the 0 to 2 are the primal fantasies and fantasies after the part object stage starts. And they involve getting engulfed, getting swallowed, robbing or getting robbed, getting chewed by a set of dentata, attack of envy, the fantasy of babies inside the mother's stomach, or fantasy of all the goodness being inside the breast, the fantasies of cannibalism. And the constitutional structure plays a very strong role in these fantasies. So all of this goes on in 0 to 2. And obviously, if you look at something as macro as trust, it would be a net result. Similarly, like safety, like reliability of the world. All the three are important outcomes of the oral stage: safety, trust, reliability. And there would be outcomes of this deeper micro processes, how well or not well they occur. Now, if we try to integrate them, one way to integrate is this. You can start with oceanic primary narcissism being a state, not a stage, leading to constitutional primal fantasy of part objects and fantasy. First, based upon experience, and then based upon archetypal activation. Should come here. We can integrate it in this way. The state of oceanic primary narcissism, towards the end of which you can see Mahler's universal, you can put Mahler's universal autism, alternating with primary hell, followed by a free affect stage, followed by a sensation precipitating affect stage, so precipitating pre-fantasy affect stage, followed by a part object relation stage, followed by constitutionally driven primal fantasy and fantasy stage. First, free, meaning first it's partly free, partly based upon experience, and then it's archetypal. Then you have the full object relation stage, and over a period of time, development of safety, reliability, experience of safety, reliability, love, trust. And this leads to internalization of a good, reliable, stable object, leading to a soothing, stabilizing core and a healthy self. This can be one provisional way of starting off the integration process. Of course, it needs micro detailing, micro tightening, conceptually, technique wise. But to start a long process, when we are first of the 1,000 steps, this can be one provisional way of looking at the integration of what all is being said about 0 to 2. If you add the transpersonal into it, and the transpersonal has elements of reincarnation, intergenerational elements. There are different approaches in transpersonal. The reincarnational approach, the intergenerational approach, the collective unconscious Jungian approach, the karmic, and the purpose of the self. If you put all of this together, where this will go will be in two parts. Some part of this transpersonal will come out in the form of constitution. And the innate nature of epistemological process is at the root of the psychic activity, and in the innate way in which the nature and the quantum of effect, that is activity, or the duration for which a stage goes or does not go. The second element is something that is spread over the program of life. So it will be activated, that transpersonal element will be activated at different parts of life across the stages. So some of it will get activated in the oral state, some in the anal, some in the phallic, and some later on in life. So across the program of life, the transpersonal elements will get activated and influence the course of the psyche and the life. If we bring that in to our integration process, slightly complicates the process. But if we can, it will not only be integration of schools of psychoanalysis, but also integration of the East and West. So with this, we have opened up the integration of the oral stage. Obviously, it is work of years and decades, but to take the first of the 1,000 steps and take it courageously with quite some assurance that we are on the right track, if not anything else, it will definitely enrich and make better result giving our technique and therapy. Thank you.